Good morning, everybody. It's morning here. I'm calling in from San Francisco. I used to be working for Imperial College at the Center of Psychedelic Research, but recently relocated to UCSF. So I have a dual affiliation with both of these institutions. And today the talk is going to have two parts. And first, I am going to walk you through the self-blinding microdose project, which is one of these more complex citizen science projects that have been executed within psychedelic research. And then talk to you more generally about psychedelic citizen science. And specifically, I will talk about PsyDAO, which is an organization that I am involved with that is trying to push the agenda of psychedelic citizen science forward. Okay, so as I said, first I'm going to talk about my research a little bit and how that intersects with citizen science. So the study that we did is the self-blinding microdose trial, and in the title, the important bit here is self-blinding. And in this context, blinding refers to what we call blinding in medicine, and that is specifically that people do not know whether they are taking a placebo or they are taking an active substance. And in this case, the active substance is a microdose. What's important to appreciate here is that typically how these placebo-controlled studies are done is that you, the patient, sign up for these trials, you go to the hospital, you meet the doctor, and then the doctor is going to give you some capsules, some pills, and you do not know whether it is placebo or the active drug that is under investigation in the trial. But what's important to appreciate is that sort of it's done for you. Like you just get the capsules, you take that home, and you do not know what is in that capsule. Here, with this self-blinding paradigm that we have developed with my colleagues at Imperial College, you are doing this whole process of blinding. And the way that it worked is that we have worked out a procedure how microdosers at home can implement their own placebo control. We made a video about it, how to do this setup. We put it online. And if you signed up for the study, then you needed to follow this online instructional video of how to blind yourself. I am not going to go through the entire setup because it is too complicated and some of the details do not matter. But there are two important elements that I would like to touch on. And one of them is that for order the self-blinding to work, we ask participants to hide their microdoses inside non-transparent gel capsules. So as you can see here on the picture, people were taking their microdoses, which in this case is a small piece of water paper, and put it inside these non-transparent gel capsules. And then, of course, some of the capsules were left empty, and those were functioning as placebos in the trial. What's not shown in the picture is that all of these capsules were then labeled with QR codes, those two-dimensional barcodes that you can read with your smartphone. And the capsules were labeled at a time when you knew that which capsules has a placebo inside and which has a placebo inside. Basically, at some point, you had two piles of capsules in front of you. You had the microdose capsules, the placebo capsules, and we give you a bunch of QR codes. And then you needed to put, and so the QR codes are labeled that either to be used with the microdose or with the placebo capsules. So then you took one of your microdose capsules, and you put it in these little zip bags and then cut out one of the corresponding QR codes, put it inside the bag, seal it, and then put it into a big bowl. And then you did it with all of these capsules. So all of these capsules at the end were in a QR code, in a zip bag, in a big bowl. And then we asked you to shuffle it, randomly select one, scan the QR code with your smartphone. And once you scan the QR code with your smartphone, what it did is that it connected with the IT infrastructure of the study, and it told you what to do with that capsule. And the instructions were either to discard the capsule, that you're not going to need it for the experiment, or something along the lines of like, you're going to need to use this capsule for the, let's say, Tuesday on the second week of the experiment. And people one by one scan these QR codes, and with each individual capsule, and then each individual capsule was assigned either to be discarded or to one of the days during the 4 days long dosing period. And what this process resulted in is that basically half of the capsules were discarded, half of the capsules were kept in the experiment, but you did not know whether you have discarded the microdose capsules or the placebo capsules. So what's really cool about here and very different is that you did this blinding process yourself. So that's why I'm calling it self-blinding. It was not done it for you as in the context of a traditional double-blind clinical study. Here you needed to put in the work and set it up yourself. But the reason why we needed to go about it this way is twofold. One of them is that, well, one of them is really a practicality, is that we started this study back in 2019. And back then, it was still much more difficult to get money for this sort of research. The cost of running a traditional double-blind RCT is very, very large, especially when we are talking about Schedule I substances such as psychedelics. And also, there's a lot of just bureaucratical hurdles that I don't want to go into because they are boring, but it's a lot of paperwork to do these trials. So we struggle to raise funds for a traditional RCT or microdosing, even though the question was obvious to us, the relationship between the placebo effect and microdosing. So we had to invent this methodology, which is basically just like a double-blind RCT, but it's much cheaper and it has much less regulatory hurdles because it is not done in a medical context. It's not that like we were seeing patients in a hospital. It's just we give out an instruction how people can do self-blinding at home if they wish to test themselves whether microdosing is better than placebo. Um, In the context of this talk, I want to emphasize a few things about the methodology, and I want to both talk about the strengths and the weaknesses. And I'm going to start with the weaknesses, and it's going to be very obvious to everybody probably listening to this talk that the weakness here is that participants use their own drugs. And practically what that means is that that drug was sourced from the black market, and that means there are going to be uncertainties regarding what was the specific substance that was used and at what exact dosage. And that criticism is valid. And what we say, or what is my answer to this criticism is that in this trial, what we have tested is real life microdosing, not a clinically defined microdosing regime. What we have tested is that microdosing works in how people are actually microdosing, which again has all of those uncertainties regarding the drug and the dosage that was also represented in this study. So that's really the big downside of it. The other one was that which was difficult for us initially, is that we needed to motivate people to participate in this study. Like this whole self-blinding process, it wasn't super complicated. It took about 45 minutes to follow those online instructions that I told you about. But still, there was a little bit of a hassle. You had to buy these non-transparent gel capsules. You had to print the QR code. So it was a little bit of time. And I remember initially when we launched the study, then nobody signed up. Like we thought that, hey, we set up this incredibly cool study and people are going to come in large numbers just to do it. And nobody started doing it. And then basically what saved the study is that we have set up almost like a mini speaker tour for me and other people in the lab, where we went to psychedelic societies and told them about the study. It was a presentation about why we think this question of placebo effect is relevant to microdosing and why we think this study is cool. And once we started doing those talks, then people actually started doing the experiment. But I want to emphasize that because I think that is one of the key elements of citizen science, is that motivation, is that you need to provide people a reason to do your study. So that's about the negatives about the self-blinding methodology. And again, the major one is the uncertainty regarding the exact drug and the dose that was used, and this issue of motivation, which is a constant in citizen science. But what we gained, I think, is pretty significant because this was completed by 191 participants, which makes it one of the largest placebo-controlled trial to date. Actually, it's funny that in the bio that I sent, I know it said that it is the largest placebo-controlled study to date, and when I wrote it, that was true. But unfortunately, since the phase 2 Compass trial has came out, and they had I think like 220 participants, something like that. So that is slightly larger than my trial. So right now that sentence is no longer true, and I will need to edit that bio. Right now, it's only the second largest placebo-controlled study to date. But that being said, that study, the Compass phase 2 study, which is the largest now, that costed millions of dollars easily. I don't know the exact cost, but I would say that was probably in that 5 to 10 million euros range. This study costed about 10,000 US dollars. So you can see that there is an incredibly large price reduction to conducting citizen science trials relative to these traditional RCTs, and that's what made this study a success. Basically, is that we had this very large sample that was very, very cheap, but we still had the placebo control. Typically, in medical research, people are thinking about that there are these observational studies where you are just following a cohort online or something like that. And that's a method that's often used in psychedelics, that you ask people to complete some baseline questionnaire, then they do some psychedelic, and then you ask them to answer those questionnaires again later, and then you measure like their improvement, but there is no control condition there. And people are thinking that there is this dichotomy that either there are these observational studies that don't have a control group, or you have the traditional double-blind RCTs, and there is nothing in the middle. And what I like about this study is that it is exactly in that middle. It's not exactly an observational study because we clearly had a placebo control condition. But on the other hand, it is clearly not a traditional RCT because we never saw the patients. They use their own drugs. This is clearly not a traditional RCT. It lives in that gray zone between these two big categories of studies that people tend to do. And I think because of that, it sort of like forces you to think about really hard about the study and like, why do we have a control condition in these trials, and what's the appropriate control condition, and all of those questions. This study, this was my favorite study to do in my career, and the reason for that is because it made us think. We were not following a template of how typically studies are done. Here, we were trying to do something completely new. So that's what I wanted to say about the methodology, and I am going to talk about the results of the trial. And just before I get into that, I want to say that so the way that the study was structured is that participants were microdosing for 4 weeks, and there were two groups in the study: the microdosing group, and if you were in that study, then you were taking 2 microdoses per week. And if you were in the placebo group, then you were taking just placebos throughout the entire study duration. I know there's a point that I want. Oh, yeah, there's one more thing that I wanted to mention here is the dose, the microdose dose. Of course, we get that question a lot, like, what's the microdose dose? In this study, we asked you to use the same microdose dose that you would use outside of the study as well. And basically, the mean dose with LSD was 13 micrograms, which falls very much within the typical range of 10 to 20 micrograms. That's what typically people use. And for people who used magic mushrooms, they used about 0.15 grams of dried grounded mushroom materials. Everything that I'm going to show you, like stats and graphs, that is when we analyzed all of the microdoses together. But if you look at the paper, then we have a sub-analysis for LSD microdoses only, and we also have another subsection for mushroom microdoses, and the results are exactly the same. So here I'm going to give you the combined stats, but if you look at LSD and mushroom separately, the results are exactly the same. And about 70% of the participants used LSD for this study. So that was the dominant drug for this study. We had two sort of outcomes for this study, and one of them is that I'm going to call the long-term outcomes. And here I am showing you how the results look like on the CAM scale, which is a measure of mindfulness. And I'm just going to walk you through it, and I'm going to show you the graphs from the other outcomes. So here we have the baseline measurement, and then here during this time, this is the 4 weeks when people are either doing microdosing or they are doing placebos. And then here is post-regime is the measurement after 4 weeks of either doing the placebos or the microdoses. First, I just want you to focus on the red line here, and this corresponds to the microdosing. And as you can see, this clearly goes up. And if you look at the error bars, you see that it's not crossing zero. So that gives you the sense that probably this is a statistically significant improvement, which is indeed the case. So far, if you just look at the red line, the microdosing group alone, it confirms what microdosers are claiming, that it increases mindfulness. However, the exciting bit is that you also consider what's happening with the blue line, the placebo group, because as you can see, they are also increasing, and the between treatment difference is no longer statistically significant. So microdosers did increase their scores on mindfulness, but the microdose group scores, statistically speaking, did not improve more than people in the placebo-controlled condition. And this is something that has become a little bit of a pet issue of mine, because I don't think that people think about this enough, or often just do not even notice that if you're running depression trials, and for 5 minutes now, I am going to talk about depression trials in general, including psychedelic and non-psychedelic studies. But the issue that I want to highlight here is that in all of these trials, there are multiple things that you can measure. And one of them is this between treatment difference, which is basically the difference between the red and the blue line here. How much better the active control condition did, condition did relative to the control condition. And if you look at 99% of depression trials, again, both with psychedelics and with other drugs, they are only going to focus on this between treatment difference. Very rare that the depression paper also discloses what was the change over time, or also often called the within subject effect, which is the difference from baseline to after the treatment, which I labeled post-regime here. But the point here is that, notice that this is what patients are experiencing. But patients are experiencing this change over time, how much better they have become after the treatment relative to before the treatment. That's clearly what patients do care about. They don't care about the between treatment difference. And this is sometimes in science, this is labeled, or the medical literature, the specific effects of the treatment. I do think that it's clearly important to distinguish that what are the specific effects of the treatment, and to distinguish it from other general factors that are contained within the placebo control condition. But on the other hand, it is weird that most depression papers do not even say how much better patients are doing in their after the treatment. And the reason why I think that's important, and I'm not going to go there, that's sort of an other talk that I sometimes give, but just very briefly, that the placebo control condition is notoriously variable. So in different trials, the placebo effect sometimes is very, very strong. Sometimes it's very, very weak, dependent on the contextual factors. So basically, in all of these trials, we are using the placebo control condition as this threshold that we are comparing against. And that is highly variable. And then we are just focusing how much better the active treatment is relative to that, which I am saying on this side is the between treatment difference. And we are completely ignoring that how much better patients actually did. And in the context of microdosing, I think this is important because as you can see in this picture here, or what I will try to communicate here, is that there is no difference in, or like there is no contradiction in the following two statements. One of them is that microdosing are doing better after microdosing, and that microdosing is just a placebo effect. Now, the second one, I am not claiming that, but I am putting that forward as a hypothesis. There is no contradiction in patients being getting better and microdosing is just being a placebo effect. And there is no contradiction there because, as you can see here, microdosers clearly did better on this mindfulness scale relative to their baseline. So microdosing does have benefits, but the magnitude of those benefits is not larger than the placebo effect, which is why the between treatment difference is not statistically significant, and which is why, scientifically speaking, you would say that microdosing is just a placebo. And often when we talk about microdosing and about the question of placebo, like it's often that, oh, like, microdosing cannot be just a placebo because I have been depressed for 3 years and it cured me of my depression. Yeah, but you haven't tried a placebo treatment in a context of not knowing what you are taking. So most people actually do not have experience of how strong the placebo effect can be. Often in this trial, when people were in the placebo group, and when we told them at the end of the trial, we told them whether they have in the placebo and the microdose group, they were in disbelief that they have taken the placebo because they were convinced that they have taken the microdose due to the large improvements that they have experienced. And there was a lot of confusion about that. And I think the reason here is that, like, a lot of people have experience in the psychedelic space, experiences of microdosing, but very few people have experience of how strong the placebo effect can be because most of us are not enrolled in a placebo-controlled study. So anyway, the what I wanted to emphasize here is 2 points, and this difference between the change over time and the between treatment difference. And I'm in a little bit of a mission to try to change that. In medicine, we should also care about how much patients better got, which is the change over time, not just the between treatment difference. And the most important point on this slide is that there is no contradiction that microdosing could be just a placebo effect, and people are getting real benefits from microdosing. So on this slide, I'm showing you this mindfulness outcome, and I just showed you because the results here are very typical. But if you look at some of the other outcomes of the study, the story is practically the same. So this is something that's called the RIF Psychological Wellbeing Scale, which is a very long questionnaire about psychological well-being. And again, the story is the same, that you can see that the scores of the microdosing people go up, but so does the placebo, and the difference is no longer statistically significant. Actually, in this slide, I am also showing you this 4 weeks follow-up. Please ignore that for the time being. So this pre-regime and post-regime, that's the same as what I call baseline and post-regime. I need to change that. Reminds me of that. And this 4 weeks follow-up, that you just ask them that like 4 weeks again to complete the same questionnaires, but they were not microdosing in this 4 weeks long period. So here, I just want you to focus on the pre to post-regime comparison. So same as qualitatively, the results are the same on well-being. Statistically significant improvement in the microdose group relative to baseline, but the difference relative to the placebo group is no longer statistically significant. This plot is exactly the same that I showed you before. This is the mindfulness graph. Life satisfaction, again, qualitatively the same story. Paranoia, qualitatively the same story. With paranoia, like lower scores are better, so you want the scores come down. So that's why it is, you can see that it's going down, but I'm talking about improvement. But here with the last one, this is actually not the same as the other ones, because in this one, the improvement, even within the microdose group, was not statistically significant. And I find that very interesting because we had this very consistent result for these for life satisfaction, mindfulness, well-being, and some other measures that I am not showing here. but cognition behaved very different. And I think the reason for that is because for cognition, for the cognitive testing, what you needed to do is that in the study we sent you this link, which is basically like an online cognitive testing suite. Like think about the memory card game that we all played as children. It's a digital version of that. It's like how quickly you can mentally rotate patterns and try to do a pattern matching task. So it was a suite of digital tests designed to measure how well you are doing cognition, well, how good is your good are your cognitive capabilities. For all of the other outcomes, those were self-reported questionnaires. So you needed to log in, and then you were completing, like answering to questions that, like, basically the scientific version of how how are you, and how are things are going. And those questionnaires, they have they measure your well-being. Of course, that is going to be much more subjective than something like this more objective measure of cognition. So the measure of cognition was much more objective with these computerized tests that are measuring your reaction time in milliseconds relative to the questionnaires that are about your subjective well-being, which by definition is going to be more subjective. So that is why I think cognition behaved differently, because it was a more objective measure of changes. And in that one, we did not see a statistically significant change in the microdose group, even relative to baseline. And just like with the other measures, the between treatment difference was not statistically significant. So when I started to talk about the results of this trial, I said that the results fall into two big buckets, and one of them is this change over time. How are the changes 4 weeks after microdosing relative to the start? And now I'm going to go to the other bucket of the results, which are the acute effects, which is that how are you doing 2 to 6 hours after you have taken the capsule, which is when the drug is going to be active. So I'm here showing you this table, and these are all of these outcomes that we measure 2 to 6 hours after you have taken a capsule. And again, this is when the drug is pharmacologically active. And then here in this column, I show you the placebo versus microdose p-value. And then I am showing you both the effect size on the native scale and on Cohen's d, which is something called the standardized mean difference. If you're a stats person, you will know that. If you don't know what standardized mean difference is, you can just ignore this column. There are two important things here. One of them is that, as you can see, there are actually quite a few measures here where there was a statistically significant difference between placebo and microdoses. And I don't show this here on the table, but I can tell you that microdosing was always improved relative to the placebo control condition. So the acute mood was better when you have taken a microdose relative to when you have taken a placebo. The acute self-rated energy levels were better when you were taking a microdose relative to a placebo. The other important thing, though, here is these numbers. And I am just going to tell you that for Cohen's d, the standardized mean difference, like typically you say that an effect is small if it's about 0.3 or smaller. A moderate or a medium effect is about 0.6 standardized mean difference. And if it's 0.8 or larger, then you talk about a large effect. And what I just want to emphasize here is that all of these effects are fairly small. As you can see, none of them actually are larger than 0.3, which again is typically what you are saying is a small effect. So there have been some statistically significant differences in some of these outcome measures that I show you, but the effects have been very small. The interesting bit about this, though, happens when we actually start to look at the data, the data about the blinding quality. So again, blinding is this medical term that you do not know what you are taking. And like often medical trials, the traditional RCTs as I said, they give you placebo or they give you the active drug, and they just assume that you can't figure out whether you're in the placebo or in the active condition. But of course, most drugs have some side effects that sometimes allow you to break the blind. That's the medical term when you figure out whether you are in the active condition or in the placebo control condition. And in this trial, after you have taken a capsule, at the end of every day, we ask you that, hey, just take a guess, was it placebo or a microdose? And that was a little bit of a throwaway question when we put that in, but that turned out to be by far the most interesting. Because this question allows you to check whether your study has truly remained blinded. If people are not breaking the blind, then then you would expect them to get this treatment guess correct about 50% of the time. If you're just guessing randomly, then you're going to still get it right 50% of the cases. But it turns out that in this trial, it was about 74%, which is much higher than the 50%, statistically significantly higher than the 50%, which indicates that some people are breaking, well, not just some, but actually a large number of people are breaking the blind, and they can figure out when they have taken the placebo versus the microdose. And in particular, that ratio was high among people who have taken the microdose. So if you have taken a microdose, then I think it was around 85% of the times you could correctly guess that you have taken a microdose. So this led to this favorite analysis of mine. And what I'm going to show in the next few slides is just looking at this acute mood measure, the PANAS, which is the top line in this table, and just going to show you the data in a different way. So what I'm going to do here is to basically take all of the scores from this PANAS measure, which is again a measure of acute mood, how are you doing, and plot it in 4 separate categories. And you can see the categories down here. And in the top row, we got condition, and it's either PL, which stands for placebo, or it's MD, which stands for microdose. And the row below is the guess, and that is how you have responded to this question that we ask you at the end of the day. Hey, do you think you have taken a placebo, or you think you have taken a microdose? So this gives you 2 times 2 equal 4 categories. And if you have taken a placebo, and if you have guessed that you have taken a placebo, then the average score is about 13. So that's sort of like the baseline within the population, so to speak. So what happens when you have taken a microdose, but you think that you have taken a placebo? And it goes up a little bit, but you can see there's a large overlap between the error bars. I can just tell you that this is not going to be statistically significant. Now, here comes the super cool bit, because when you have taken a placebo, but you thought it was a microdose, then suddenly the scores jump up all the way to 18. And it basically remains the same if you have taken a microdose and you thought that you were taking a microdose. So notice is that basically this graph, even though I'm showing you 4 data points, but they really fall into 2 categories. The first 2 are clearly the same, and the second 2 are clearly the same. The first 2 are low, the second 2 are high. But what's interesting is to notice is that what seems to be driving the difference is not the condition, it's not what people have taken, but what was their guess, what they think that they have been taking. So it seems that the benefits of microdosing are not driven by the actual drug, it's by people's belief about what they have taken. And you can clearly see in this figure that the effect of the guess is way, way larger than the effect of the condition, which I think is just a really cool example of mind over matter and really how strong the placebo effect can be. And I am showing you now on this slide data from the PANAS, but this finding was very consistent across all of the other outcomes that we have measured. So again, here we have PANAS. This is the same as from the previous slide. Then we got acute mood. This is another mood measure, but that's a different way. I'm going to ignore this for right now. We also measured anxiety. this is post-acute anxiety, and that is because we have as anxiety sort of like at the end of the week. It was structured a little bit differently, but practically speaking, it's exactly the same what I told you with the acute measures. And again, what seems to matter is that not the condition, but the guess. Again, with anxiety, like lower is better. So that's why these last two data points are lower when the guess is microdose. Post-acute depression, again, lower scores are better qualitatively, the same story. What matters is the guess, not the condition. And then last, post-acute well-being, same story. Now, I'm going to come back to this one that I ignored when I went around. And this is the cognitive measure. And remember what I told you regarding the cognitive measures when I was talking about like the long-term outcomes. That was measured differently. It's more of an objective measure because it was measured on a computerized test, not on a self-reported questionnaire. And here you can see that actually neither condition nor guess makes a difference. So I think that again strengthens that narrative that actually, what we could be capturing with the self-reported questionnaires are basically like an enhanced placebo effect, because if you're turning to the more objective outcomes, then not even guess is making a difference. So I think that was like a cool, like this cognitive measure that was actually complicated to integrate into the study because these companies charge you a pretty penny. So I had to beg them that, hey, I'm running a citizen science study. I don't have NIH money. Like, give it to me cheap. And in the end, they did. And it was really worth the fight because these objective measures are really behaving very differently from the self-reported questionnaire. So it was worth the pain. Let me just, so this is my last slide on the study, the self-blinding microdose study. What I just wanted to add here is that, so this study was done with healthy people. And if you look at the literature, I mean, like, outside of my trial, the work that has been done with healthy people, I think this is by and large consistent with the literature, what we have been finding. There is one study that came out from New Zealand last year, or maybe even the year before that, that was with LSD microdosing with depression, with depressed patients. So that's a clinical population. And there, I think the results were a bit more encouraging regarding microdosing. It was still a very small effect, but this whole story about like gapping and when you are breaking the blind, it's not really true anymore. I do believe that, or at least based on that one trial, it seems that microdosing does have a genuine effect on depression. It's a very small effect, but it is an effect nonetheless. The other thing that I wanted to highlight here is that, like, for better or worse, but after this trial came out, like, I have became a little bit known as like critical of microdosing, but like, I think, that's not really the point that I want to make with all of this, with analyzing the data this way regarding the gas, because I think, for most people who are microdosing, they just want to get the benefits. They want to feel better. They want to be more creative. Most people who microdose, and generally most patients in medicine, do not really care whether their improvements are due to some sort of placebo effect or is it driven by the genuinely active component of the treatment. I have never met a depressed patient who got better from placebo complaining is that, hey, I don't want to be better, like, it was placebo, it was all fake. Patients don't give a crap about that. It's just us, like, researchers and biostatisticians who care about that, and for good reasons. But from a patient perspective or from a microdosing perspective, just care about getting better. And what's the mechanism behind that change? I don't think that matters to most people. Of course, I get the question a lot that, hey, do you think I should be microdosing? And typically the way I answer it is that if you feel enthusiastic about it, then probably it is going to help, because like you still need to elicit the placebo response. Let's say that microdosing is just a placebo effect, and I'm not claiming that, but let's say for the sake of argument it is. It still means that you have to elicit that placebo effect. And what is the core component of the placebo effect is the expectation of a benefit. You expect to get better. So if you are enthusiastic about microdosing and you have an expectation of a benefit, then it's very likely that you are really going to get some benefits, and that some other treatments would not be able that you would not be able to get from other treatments where you do not have that expectation of a benefit. So if you want to be microdosing, like I'm not going to talk you out of it. Just don't read my papers about it and questions about whether it's a placebo effect or not. That being said, overall, I think we are in the early days of microdosing research. I highlighted that trial from New Zealand because that's the first and only trial that looked at microdosing in a clinical population. And there the results are more promising, but it's just like one trial and it was not a very large trial. So we just have to see how that pans out. So that's everything I wanted to say about microdosing, and I am going to transition to talk about citizen science a little bit more broadly. Sorry for sipping my coffee through the talk, but it's early in the morning here. So why citizen science is the future of psychedelic research. And first, what I just want to show it to you is this is a leaflet from Oregon. As probably many of you know, Oregon is one of the few states where psilocybin services are legal. You can get legal psychedelic psychotherapy in Oregon. Denver is the other state where you can also, Colorado. Denver is the capital of Colorado, where you can also access psilocybin services legally. And I don't want to go into like how it works legislatively. It's actually a somewhat complicated regulation around it, and it's different in these two states. But the point is that you can access psilocybin services. If you live in Oregon, you can get psychedelic therapy legally. And this is the leaflet of one of those psychedelic service centers. And what is important here is that if you look at, so let's go for the high dose. And the reason why I want to look at the high dose is that typically what we use in psychedelic clinical trials, so for example, here at UCSF, we use psilocybin, so the active drug of magic mushrooms, and we administer 25 milligrams. And 25 milligrams of psilocybin, that roughly corresponds to 4 grams of dried magic mushrooms. So that corresponds to this quantity. Now, of course, with mushrooms, there is a large variability in the psilocybin content. But what I wanted to just highlight is that like that's the therapeutic dose. Everything here, there is much less evidence whether it's efficacious to treating any mental health condition. Here, for this dose, I think there is pretty good evidence at this point. So look at the cost. It's $3,500 for basically 4 grams of mushroom. Now, I don't know how it's working in Finland and then what are the prices on the black market there, but like 4 grams of magic mushrooms, like here in San Francisco, you can buy it on the street for $50 or cheaper. And, here it's $3,500. Like that is a lot more. Now, of course, where probably the service center would push back is that here what you're getting is not just the magic mushroom, but you also get some therapeutic talk sessions. So if you look at down here, it says that 1 hour preparatory session, 1 experiential session, and 1 hour integration session is included in this price. But still, we went from $50 of 4 grams of mushrooms to $3,500 of the same amount of mushrooms and 2 times 1 hour talk therapy. The value proposition is still very, very low. And I think, this actually captures this issue around psychedelic medicine of scalability. I think there is good emerging evidence that psychedelics are efficient in treating a number of mental health conditions, but the costs are ridiculously high. And that makes it very difficult to scale. And the reason why the costs are high is basically because of the talk therapy component. We can produce drugs for cheap, and as there's going to be more and more demand for psychedelics, the production costs are going to come down. But that cost with the talk therapy, that's what drives up the prices. And that's another topic that I like to talk about that I'm just going to touch on here, that if you want psychedelic therapy to really make an impact globally on mental health, then these prices need to come down. Here, what I just wanted to highlight is this very large cost, and again, contrast that with the 50 grams. And one of the and I said it during the microdosing trial as well, that we basically ran 200 patients in a double-blind RCT style trial. If you run that as a traditional RCT, the costs are about 5 to 10 million euros. I think that's realistic. For our study, it was 10,000 US dollars, much, much lower. And you can see a little bit the same here, like doing mushrooms on your own is about $50 for 4 grams. Here, if you're doing it in this legal environment, it's $3,500. So there is this really large price gap between how psychedelics are working underground and how they are working above ground in the clinics and in this legal environment. And what that means is that all of the studies that we are running with psychedelics tend to have a really, really small sample size. So as I said, my study had about 200 patients, and there is only one larger study that had a larger number of patients, the Compass phase 2 trial, that 220. And I think the third largest study, I think that was the German study, or no, so actually the NYU alcoholism study that had 100 and something. And if you look at like other RCTs, these are small studies, but they're already really, really expensive with psychedelics. So there is a big price difference between doing the things underground and above ground, and how that is going to sort of like become an issue in the literature is that sample sizes are very, very small. But notice that with psychedelics, unlike with other medications, a lot of people are doing that on Friday and Saturday evenings. So I think what is really the opportunity for psychedelic citizen science is that people are doing psychedelics already. So if we just find a way to basically capture their experiences in a scientifically meaningful format, then we could really enhance the data collection around about the effects of psychedelics. So we actually have some plans to go to raves, to the Boom Festival next year, and hopefully to Azora as well, and to run some studies there. Because at one of these festivals, if you just manage to capture data from 1% of the people who are doing psychedelics there, then basically in a week, you can get a larger sample size than what you'll be able to get from these clinical trials that are costing millions of dollars. And again, there are going to be different strengths and weaknesses to the clinical trials. I am not saying that citizen science needs or wants to replace the traditional clinical research, but I think there are clearly opportunities to complement traditional RCTs. The other thing which I think is important, that in my view, we are missing the forest for the tree with modern psychedelic research. And that is because we are focusing too much on the medical use case. And the reason for that, of course, is because the playbook is something very similar as with cannabis, is that first, it's the medical use that can gain legitimacy within society, and then we can branch out into recreational use. But the issue is that with these trials that we are running, is a relatively small segment of the population who would be eligible, but it doesn't mean that psychedelics do not have benefits for populations beyond that. And here, where I see like a contrast with traditional antidepressants, SSRIs, is that SSRIs are only useful to people who are depressed. Psychedelics are not like that, because I think there are benefits for people who are not clinically speaking. I mean, I have now so many friends. I'm in my mid-30s, and this is an age when a lot of people get married, settle down, have a kid. And I was at a high school reunion party. I'm from Budapest, Hungary, and I was back home this summer, and I went to this high school reunion thing. And there were like so many people who just seemed like so gray. It was very obvious that they are not satisfied with their life. And I'm not saying that they don't love their kid or their wife, but just life has become like very monotonous for them. Like, especially when you get kids, like, your social life is being reduced. You get a job, every week is the same, every weekend is the same. And a lot of people fall into that pattern of like every day is the same, every week is the same. And life is just becoming a lot more gray. And I think that's where there's a lot of opportunity to use psychedelics to sprinkle some color into the life of people who are suffering from this, which is basically just the circumstances of modern life. So the point that I want to make here is that where I think also why citizen science is a natural marriage to psychedelics is because of this relevance that I think more people could benefit from psychedelics than the number of people who are medically depressed and who meet the criteria for advancing into these trials. But there's not going to be money to run trials on healthy people. When again, healthy, I mean medically healthy people who are in this sort of like grayness of life. They are not going to be meeting the criteria for clinical depression. Nonetheless, there could be benefits of psychedelics for that. And I think just because of the numbers game, that's where psychedelics actually could be more impactful. So if you look at this graph here on the left, what is it showing to you is that depression scores are in a large nationally representative sample. And on this particular scale, what they are showing to you here is that the blue bars, like they are the ones who like meet depression, and the green ones did not. There are two important points to notice on this figure. One of them is that it's more or less like a continuous graph. It's not like that there is like a big breaking point where it's not like a binomial distribution. Is that there's a big chunk of the data here and another big chunk of the data here. It's continuous. So there is no like clear cut between depressed people and non-depressed people. The other one is that if you would add up the heights of the blue bars, that's much, much smaller than if you add up the heights of the green bars. There are many more people who are not suffering from depression, again, according to some clinical criteria. And because of that, I think, there is potentially a larger benefit there for psychedelic, potential for a larger. So how we are going to try to address this? And about a year ago, I became involved with PsyDAO. And PsyDAO is, well, let me start with DAO. DAO stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization. And it is basically coming from the crypto world, from the Web3 world. But don't worry, I'm not going to try to sell you Bitcoin or any other things like that. But PsyDAO is part of the larger movement called DeSci, which stands for Decentralizing Science. And then DeSci is basically how we can use Web3 technologies to make science better. And there's a lot has been said about science as a failed institution, and this talk is not about that, so I'm not going to go into that. But science is clearly a very archaic institution, and DeSci wants to change that using Web3 technology. I don't want to talk about DeSci too much because that's another topic, but if you want to just read up on it. But basically the way that it works is that at a high level, is that you are releasing tokens, which are just basically just like Bitcoin, but it's not Bitcoin. These are PsyDAO tokens that is representing your contribution to the field. And that can be a financial contribution, or sorry, you can gain the tokens for your contribution to the activities of PsyDAO. So the tokens, the PsyDAO tokens represent your work, but they are also representing IP NFTs. So it also means that if you're holding these tokens that you can gain either by doing volunteer work for PsyDAO or donating money, you get these tokens that are representing some fraction of the IP portfolio that comes out of the work conducted by PsyDAO. So yeah, PsyDAO is a psychedelic DAO. Again, there's a larger movement of decentralized science, and DAOs are these organizations that are organizing around the topic of interest. There is Vita DAO, which is about vitality and longevity. there is CheiroDAO, and there is PsyDAO, which is the psychedelic version of this DAO. And again, it is using Web3 technologies, which is basically blockchain technology, to realign stakeholder incentives. And what we see as the role of PsyDAO within the broader psychedelic research ecosystem is to focus on use cases that are not going to be picked up by mainstream medical funders. So mostly recreational. And one of the flagship projects that we are working on is something called OPSI, which is the Open Science Psychedelic. Actually, I forgot what it really stands for, but it's not exactly the. I know it's not like the letters are not a one-to-one deflection of the name, but basically, it's an open science psychedelic data capturing system. And the way that it would work, so it's actually already being set up. This OPSI is not ready yet, but we hope to deploy it sometime early next year. So this is an open access data collection platform where we are hoping to capture people's experiences with psychedelics who are using this in a naturalistic manner. And what's different about this and a lot of other survey studies is that here we pay you with PsyDAO tokens. So we ask you for your data from your psychedelic experiences. But here in exchange, you also get tokens which have actually real value. You can go to these coin exchanges on the internet and you can sell your PsyDAO token. Like you can get like regular like cold hard cash for it. So there's a lot of survey-based research already going on with psychedelics, and typically they have this one-directional nature. We, the research team, put up a survey. We ask you to complete that survey, and then we analyze that data, publish it, and maybe we send you an email saying thank you. But you, the psychedelic user, has created value for us, but us, the research community, really did not create value for you. And that's what we want to change with PsyDAO. We want to make a bi-directional value creation. So basically, in this model, PsyDAO, this organization, is an intermediary between the research team. They come to us that they want to run a study through OPSI, and then now, if members of the psychedelic community complete that study, they are getting these PsyDAO tokens, which again have real economic value. And they also give you voting rights within the organization. So you can have to navigate the future of PsyDAO. With these tokens, you can vote for what sort of studies the PsyDAO should vote. So it's not only that you can like exchange it for cold hard cash, but you can also help to navigate the future of PsyDAO and for psychedelic research. And you don't just get the tokens, because what we want to do with PsyDAO is also to we are onboarding. I'm one of the researchers who is like driving this OPSI, but we are having some other psychedelic researchers who are starting to be affiliated with OPSI. And we want to run only studies that are actually like really benefiting psychedelic users. With a lot of these survey studies, unfortunately, I must say that it feels that they're not really well thought through. And we feel bad for people who are donating time for that. So we hope that with PsyDAO, we are going to raise the standards in terms of what sort of the survey studies that we are doing. You also get the tokens of the psychedelic users. And also all of the data is going to be openly accessible. Of course, it is going to be anonymized. So there's not going to be any issues around that. But what we want to ensure is that you, the user, get maximum scientific output for the time and effort that you have put in completing. There's a lot of discussion about how science is broken and reproducibility and code sharing and data sharing and everything. Every piece of work that comes out of PsyDAO, we are mandating that if you are publishing data that's collected through OPSI or any other of PsyDAO initiatives, the code has to be shared. And everything that you're claiming in the paper, there has to be some sort of a Jupyter notebook, which is a Python notebook that shows how you have produced your data, because too much of scientific research is unfortunately not reproducible. And here we want to be really be at the forefront of that, and to adopt a lot of these recommendations for other people who have been thinking how science is broken, and adopt that and be that an integral part of PsyDAO. So not only you get these tokens, which again have multiple uses, but you also get insurance for the high research standards that you are contributing your time to. So that's really what I wanted to say. So I have focused initially on the self-blinding study, which is this large-scale placebo-controlled citizen science trial. And I started with that to talk to you some of the pros and the cons of citizen science and how it works in practice. So I talked about citizen science general. And again, the benefits are the reduced cost, much larger sample size, and you can ask questions that you can't do in traditional clinical research. And I think my hunch is that in the long term, that's going to be more impactful than traditional clinical research. And lastly, I talked about PsyDAO, which is an organization that is trying to harness Web3 technology to do large-scale psychedelic citizen science. I think my time is up for the talk, so thank you very much for your attention, and let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you for the interesting presentation, Balázs. I want to encourage everyone to write your questions to the Q&A section, and it's nice to see there are already a few questions there. But I'd like to start by asking a few questions myself. The first question is that what led you to include paranoia as a variable to be measured?
Oh, we had an MD on the study team. David Erizzo is actually the medical lead of the Imperial College Psychedelic Research team, and he had some concerns about paranoia with psychedelics, and it was like a precautionary measure. Like we wanted to potentially capture also the negative effects of microdosing. So that's why we had in paranoia. We just wanted to be able to, we wanted not just to focus on the potential positives, but also on the potential negatives. And in this case, actually, paranoia has decreased. So, even though it was put in as a measure to potentially capture something negative, that turns out to be a positive for microdosing.
Okay, thank you. The next question is that, isn't pattern matching only a single variable in a whole nexus of different processes that comprise cognition? And why did you choose pattern matching as the salient process to measure?
So we didn't just use pattern matching. So pattern matching was just an example. So the way that it worked is that there were 8 different tests. One of them was pattern matching. The other one was this memory was this was published a few years ago, so I will not be able to recall the name all of the tests. But basically, you did 8 of these tests, and then we calculated like an average Z-score across all of those tests. So we measured cognitive performance in various domains. We basically averaged the outcome scores across all of these domains, and that's what you have seen, this average measure across various cognitive domains. That's what you seen on the graphs. But good question. I didn't mention that, but it was not just pattern matching. It was a number of tests, and we took the average measure to be your cognitive. We called it the cognitive performance score. Yeah, so that's it.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. My third question is that, could it be that there are multiple levels of feedback involved in these results? I mean that if people feel more happy, energetic and creative, they might be more eager to think that they must be on the microdose group. And if they don't feel so good, they probably think that they must have taken the placebo. So it might not be that the belief leads to the increase in mood or the placebo effect, but maybe like some spontaneous increases in mood might lead to the belief. What do you think about this?
Yeah, so actually that's a very hot topic in this discussion around blind breaking in psychedelics. The term is that when people are guessing their treatment condition right, there are two we also need to ask them that what is the reason that you have asked better? Because the best case scenario for a medical trial is that the patients are improving in their medical condition so much that they are thinking that, hey, I must be in the active group because there is no other way that, my symptoms would have reduced so much, or I'm doing so much better now. And in the medical literature, this is called benign unblinding, because this is not bothersome. If anything, this is the ultimate goal of medicine, that you're very noticeable improvements. On the other side, there is something called the malicious unblinding, which is when you're breaking blind on the side effects. So imagine you're going to a trial, and with these trials, like the medical team needs to tell you about the likely side effects. And we are saying that, hey, probably your skin is going to be dry, which is actually typical with SSRIs. Then you enroll in the study and you notice a few weeks later that you need to put on lotion all the time because your skin is dry. It's not hard to put together that probably you're in the active condition. And this is not malicious unblinding, because now it could be that now that you know that you're on the active drug, and then I must be better. But, I think, with microdosing, generally, it is very likely that in most medical trials, there is a mix of both of these cases. In the microdose study, specifically, we asked people to give us the reason, what was the primary cue that they guessed a microdose. And I think it was like 80% of the cases. Again, look up the paper for the exact number. But people have said something along the lines of like feeling jittery, tension in the stomach, tension in the body. So it's basically what in psychedelic literature known as body load. But that is typically like a side effect. Like very few people have said that I have guessed microdoses because of the noticeable improvements in my mood or whatever. It's almost always has been due to these bodily effects of psychedelics. So of course, we're talking about a microdose, so these are not as pronounced as with macrodose. But for people, especially who have been taking psychedelics in large quantities before, those are very noticeable effects. And then it's very easy to put together when you're in a microdose condition. By distinguishing these two cases of like malicious and benign unblinding, I think that's a very good point, because again, the benign unblinding, ultimately you want that. This malicious unblinding, this can mess with your between treatment difference and your estimation of the true treatment effects.
Okay, thank you. My last question is that in the context of psychedelic research, what kind of other topics could be investigated with this kind of citizen science approach? And are there any research questions that you are currently interested in?
So what we are right now doing is that, or what we are setting up with this OPSI, is to set up a study on the effects of long-term psychedelic use. So most of these studies are like, we measure your baseline, you do psychedelics, 1, 2, 3 sessions, and then how are you doing like 3 months later and 6 months later? And maybe there is a 12-month follow-up. But that's the structure of the vast majority of clinical trials on psychedelics. What we want to address with OPSI is that how are psychedelics are going to affect people if you're using psychedelics, let's say 3-4 times a year, which I think is typical for recreational users, but you do that over a decade. There is zero data on that, and there is not going to be any clinical research on that. It will be just like too complicated to set up, follow people that long. So that's why I said during the talk that with citizen science, the goal is not to replace clinical research, is to complement it. And this is a question that is not going to be addressed by traditional clinical research, but I think it's very relevant to many psychedelic users. Like, there's so much data on these effects of like 1 or 2 drug administrations, but I think it's more interesting that like, hey, what are the effects of long-term psychedelic use? And I think that's clearly relevant to a lot of people in the psychedelic research community. Another thing that we want to address is follow people who use psychedelics on their own initiatives, who have some sort of a condition that would exclude them from participating in traditional medical research. So, for example, borderline personality disorder is seen as a red flag in psychedelic research. And to the best of my knowledge, in every single psychedelic clinical trial, people with borderline personality disorder are excluded. Now, that does not mean that people with borderline personality disorder do not take psychedelics. So, what we want to do is to capture that data. We are not encouraging people with borderline personality disorder to do psychedelics, but if you have that condition and you decide on your own initiative to do psychedelics, then it is scientifically very like it is very meaningful data to capture that, so we can really see whether it is just like a common belief that borderline personality disorders are incompatible with psychedelics or not. So yeah, right now this long-term psychedelic research or like the effects of long-term psychedelic use, that's what we are focusing on with the citizen science initiative, because that's what we are seeing as complementing it. Oh, and sorry, like and these the excluded ones, as we are calling it. And we also want to set up a study which is like very specific about like ravings. Many of us at Psydo really like the Boom Festival. I'm from Hungary, so been to Ozora a few times. And you know, at these places, what happens is that people use psychedelics, often mixing with other drugs, for a short time but very intensely. And we want to set up a study that captures the effects of that, and like, you know, more broadly, because I think one of the important aspects here is that with all of these raves, there's a very strong community aspect. People go to these raves together, and it's more than just about the drugs. So we want to set up a raving study, which is about the effects of raving broadly understood, where it is not just about the drugs, but it's about the whole raving experience. Again, there's not going to be NIH funding for that, so we might as well go ahead and do it with citizen science.
Right. I really like the points you made. It seems that it makes like questions approachable that in the normal paradigm simply one cannot like do that kind of research. So it opens new avenues or new questions.
Yeah, and I think those questions are relevant to many people. So
Yeah.
you know, there is that's why I said that I think you are missing the forest for the tree in traditional psychedelic medical research. And like, you know, where I work, and that's what I do. That's my day-to-day living at UCSF. I am designing, running, and analyzing these traditional RCTs. So I have nothing against them, but I just see that, you know, we are there's there's a rich field that this medical research is just not going to tap into.
True. Next, I want to take a few questions from the Q&A, and there are quite a lot of questions there actually. But I will start with the question, what kinds of ethical questions do you see in citizen? Oh, sorry, I missed a question. It somehow slipped from me. Well, basically it was like, what kind of ethical questions do you see in citizen science with psychedelics?
So I think what's important is that how we are framing these studies, and I don't want to encourage anybody to do psychedelics. By and large, I believe that psychedelics are beneficial for most people, but not for everybody. And what we want to do with Psydo is to collect data on people who have decided to take psychedelics on their own initiative. We are just capturing data for something that's happening regardless of our actions. And like, you know, when we set it up, the self-blinding microdose study, like anybody who has done research before knows that like doing any experiments with the Schedule 1 drugs is incredibly difficult for these ethical reasons, especially for this one, which is like this weird methodology. People are going to do their own placebo control. Like this was a very hard study to get through the ethics committee. But this was really the thing that convinced them, is that we're not giving drugs to anybody. These people are going to microdose anyway. So then might as well collect data on that and help to enrich our scientific knowledge about these drugs. We never advertised microdosing. We are clearly not saying that this is a treatment that's going to help with your depression. And we are using the same approach with Psydo. We are not pushing anybody to do psychedelics. And, you know, we don't have to, like, enough people are using psychedelics on their own initiative. So I think, like, this, a lot of these ethical issues go away if you're framing it this way. We are not advertising psychedelic use. We are just capturing data about psychedelic use that's happening regardless.
Right. Next, you mentioned that you only started getting participants after you started promoting the study to psychedelic societies. Do you think it might somehow affect the results, since this might have some relevance to who participated in the study and their expectations?
Yeah, it's 100% true. Like, especially with that study, like, we always knew that there is going to be a selection bias. We always knew that we are going to get people who are into psychedelics. You had to use your own drug, which means that, like, you had to have some exposure to, those sort of circles. Like, we knew that we're not going to get people who, like, who are uninterested in psychedelics and then hear about this study and then, suddenly, like, oh yeah, like, let's do this, like, self-blinding microdose trial. That's not going to happen. We knew that there's going to be a limitation of the study. So yes, we got people who had high expectations for microdosing, and they were people who are very engaged with psychedelic culture, and that's one of the downsides of the study. But I must say that this is generally true for medical research. Like, you in even in SSRI trials, which are the traditional antidepressants, you get people who have some positive thinking about SSRIs and traditional antidepressants. Like, generally, people sign up for trials that are testing interventions that they have some positive attitude towards to. Otherwise, why you would sign up? Like, this is a big topic now in the psychedelic literature, is that, like, a lot of researchers use psychedelics themselves and how that is going to bias the results. And I think that's true, but that's true for the vast majority of medicine. Like, who is doing meditation research? It's people who are meditating and who are getting benefits from meditation, of course. That's why they are researching this, because they have some interest in it. I have a few friends in that field, and all of them are hardcore meditators. And when I ask them about it, they say that there is not a single person in the field who have not tried meditating or who have tried meditation and did not get benefits from it. I think, and this is again not specific to psychedelics, this is broadly like medical research. Everybody is coming with biases and expectations and different point of views of life and what's going to work, what's not going to work. That's not going to change. There is not, like, perfectly unbiased researchers. Like, I mean, the best thing that you can do is to be honest and upfront about your biases. And I think, that's the way forward. I think, we in the scientific literature, we are, like, sometimes too much just like wear the badge of that I am, like, completely unbiased, but that doesn't exist, and that's fine. They are people. We all have a different path in life. We have different life experiences. Just be honest about where you are coming from, and I think that's the future.
Thank you. Next question in the chat is, how can the researchers be sure that the participants follow the procedure correctly?
So we actually had some built-in, like, fail-safes, not for every step of the setup. But if you, like, scan some of the QR codes, then you could not scan some of the other QR codes. This is where we need to go more into the details of the setup. But we had, like, some checks whether they have followed the self-blinding procedure. And I think there's, like, one or two people who we excluded because of that, because, like, they scanned these QRs in a combination that would not have been allowed. But in terms of, like, so that's, like, one part of the question, just like following this setup. We had some fail safes there. It wasn't perfect. And yeah, probably there are going to be one or two people in the data set who made some sort of a mistake. That's very likely. The other part is that, like, following the instructions in the sense of, like, taking the capsules on time. And we had, like, every day when they needed to take a capsule, they needed to confirm that. Of course, you can still make a mistake or cheat or whatnot. But again, that's not just true for our study. That's true for all medical research. Sometimes people forget to take their pills in traditional RCTs as well. And this is like a debate now in this research, is this question of internal versus external validity, where internal validity refers to this, how consistently people follow the protocol, and external validity is how much this protocol is transferable to real life. And traditional RCT is very much concerned only with internal validity. Like often, if you have these dosette boxes, these dosette boxes are those medical boxes that elderly people often use, where for each day of the week, their medicines are put in advance. And often in these RCTs, they give you these dosette boxes, and you need to take one. And at the end of the study, you need to return this dosette box. And if they see that they have forgot to take the medicine one or two times, they just exclude their data. But of course, in real life, sometimes people forget to take their pills, right? That's just, again, the nature of life. Ultimately, what you're interested in is whether a medication or an intervention that you're interested in, is it going to work in real life or not? If it's working in this very tightly controlled RCT with very strict patient inclusion and exclusion criteria, that's important. I'm not saying that's not. But the ultimate question is whether it's working in real life or not. So I think there is this movement now, and this is not specific to psychedelics, to open up a little bit towards external validity. Traditionally, RCTs, they're just very hardcore into their internal validity, and that's what researchers are focusing on. But especially, actually, I think SSRIs have changed that, because if you look at the SSRI trials, the trials themselves look good. But now we know from phase 4 studies, phase 4 studies are called the post-marketing studies. So when a medication hits the market and you still run studies on them, and in practice, they just don't look nearly as good as they do in trials. And I think there is a recognition of that in the broader medical field. And now people are more concerned about external validity. So, with a lot of these negatives, specifically about the microdose study, that people use their own drugs, I am not really concerned about that. And that's not because those are not valid questions, but our trial did not meant to investigate microdosing as this very rigidly defined 10 micrograms of LSD. What we're interested in is whether microdosing works the way people microdose. That's a question of external validity. It's a different question whether a tightly controlled microdosing regime works or not. And we clearly, our trial clearly did not investigate that. It investigated whether microdosing works the way people microdose.
Right. I think that's a very important point.
Yeah.
The next question in the chat is from, or in the Q&A, is from Arthur Shurgin. So the question is, do you think, would it be worthwhile to study the effect of microdosing following a treatment with a full dose, once the pump has been primed, so to speak? And the above question pertains to psilocybin.
So the people are doing that. So there are some people who want to use microdosing as an integration tool. And, I am not super hopeful about that would work better than just microdosing on its own. But I think where it could work is almost we often talk about is that okay, you do your psychedelics and you gain some insight that, let's say, you need to fix that relationship with that friend or with that family member. And then you feel very motivated to do that after your psychedelic session. But as time goes on, that motivation just wanes. And where I could see microdosing after a full dose psychedelic to be effective is just almost as a reminder to that state of mind, to what you were feeling at the end of that journey, to that motivation. Is that what do you need to change in your life? I would have a hard time, just from a pharmacological perspective, I don't see a synergistic effect, but I can see a synergistic effect, psychologically speaking, that you have taken the large dose, you had some insights, and now you take a little dose, and just to remind yourself of what was that you felt that you need to change that. Like, you maybe feel a little bit of that body load that we were talking about. So maybe it takes you back a little bit, to that state of mind. Like, of course, it's a microdose, so you're not going to be tripping, but to help you to renew that commitment to being better. I don't consider myself a mental health researcher. I'm more of like a statistician guy. I really enjoy like designing these trials. But one thing that I have noticed is that for the patients that come here to the UCSF and just like the friends that I have, is that people who are unwell, they often know what they would need to do. It's just very difficult to make that change, to call up that old friend, or to be go outside of the house more. So I almost feel like that's where like psychedelics are a little bit different. Like I started to think about psychedelics as like a motivational therapy. I think patients often know what they need to do, but psychedelics gives you the kick in the ass to actually do it. That motivation. Anyway, I know that's not exactly the question, but I wanted to touch upon that because I've been thinking about that a lot recently. That it's kind of like weird that I think most people know what they would need to do to get better, or at least they have a sense of what they could try, and they just don't do it. I think that's interesting.
Thank you. The next question in the chat is that, can you explain to a non-scientist why the fact that many of the diagrams showed the microdose appear visually above the placebo in the diagram doesn't matter because it's not statistically significant? Is this difference just a coincidence, or is it so that it might point to an effect, but this effect cannot be statistically determined?
So, like, generally speaking, like, the smaller an effect is, the larger sample you need. So, like, there is this interplay between like how big an effect is and how big of a sample size you need in order to detect it. The larger the effect, the less sample size you need, right? And with these figures, like, let me go back to this one. Yeah, so like here, like these are the confidence intervals, and what they are showing is that I need to be careful here because there is a very careful statistical interpretation of this. What they show you is that if you would repeat this experiment an infinite number of times, then 95% of the time, your estimate would be fall within this range. And the same for the other part. And what the overlaps are showing is that, like, there is like no, for most of the cases, you would not be able to distinguish those two cases. That does not mean that there is not a true effect. It just means that the effect is so small that you would need a much larger sample size in order to show it. But one of the important thing here to notice is that there is something called statistical significance and something called clinical effectiveness. Like, again, you can have let's say we are running a very large study with microdosing. And then let's say that actually this mindfulness is not a bad example of this. And then let's say, we are running a study with 500 people. And then let's say like, that these affect bars are much smaller. And then, sort of like this is also like much smaller. And it like comes up here. Let's pretend that this red one comes up here. The blue one comes up just here. And the error bars are so small that they don't overlap. But sometimes error bars can be overlap and still have a statistically significant difference. So like it's a little bit different, but like if error bars overlap, that's a good indication that most likely it's not going to be statistically significant. So, if we have the scenario that I said, it would mean that statistically there's a difference between these two treatments. But if you would look on the y-axis, that would mean that there is only a half a point difference on this mindfulness measurement. That's a very, very small difference. So actually, if you're talking about like depression measures, which I just know that literature better, there is something called the Hamilton Depression Scale, and that is what's most often used to measure depression. And like, one of the items is, for example, how much you sleep each night. And like, there are like various ways that you can respond. It is that they have a good night of sleep, 8 hours every day. More often than not, I sleep 8 to 7 hours a week. Sometimes I wake up, but my sleep is good. That's 1 point of difference. Now imagine like this difference on the Hamilton scale. If it would be like a half a point difference, that's not a meaningful difference. Like just like, given the response options that I told you, like, if a 3 is that most nights I sleep 7-8 hours and generally my sleep is good, 8 being, or so like 4 is that my sleep is good and I sleep 8 hours every day. Now that half a point difference is not clinically meaningful. So it's important to distinguish this clinical and statistical significance. And I think that's why, like, remember at this table, I said that these effects are very, very small. Like, even if these are statistically significant, like, I am not sure that this 2.2 difference of this acute mood measure is something which is like actually meaningful difference. If you would plot that, like, if people without any drug complete this questionnaire, just the ebb and flow of life, then the average variability of this measure is about 5 points. The mean effect of a microdose is 2.2. So if, like, the ebb and flow of life is 5 points, that 2 points is actually meaningful. And it's a little bit, that's why, like, remember when I talked about the microdose study from New Zealand that had the depressed patients. And they did an analysis, something similar to that. And it didn't come out this way. There actually does look like that the drug condition matters, not just the drug. But the difference, I think I want to be accurate. So like, I think they had, like, one of the outcome measures that they had is what is called a mood VAS, where VAS stands for Visual Analog Scale. And it's when, like, you have a slider, like a digital slider, and, one hand is 0, the other one is 100. How good is your mood? 0 to 100. 0 is the worst, 100 is the best. And in that study with microdosing from New Zealand, the difference was, I think, 2 points on this mood VAS, again, out of 100. So, like, even though if it's statistically significant, like, I'm not sure if it has any clinically meaningful difference. So anyway, I know that I probably have detracted a little bit from the question, but what I think is important here is that beyond just statistical significance, also think about these clinically meaningful changes.
Right. Could a simple way to summarize what you said be something like that we use these statistical methods because we try to exclude the possibility that the results that we have are simply chance variation, or that we get them simply from chance?
Yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. And then it's a related but separate question whether the magnitude of that effect, you could get it's one question, and what we are statistically testing is whether it could be by chance. And then the related question is that is the effect large enough to be impactful in the context of everyday life?
Right, yeah. Those are two different questions.
Yeah, good way of putting it. Thank you.
The next question in the chat is that, do you know if other researchers or groups have already followed the lead of your clever study design?
So there is one study that's using it, yes. And so actually we launched like a version 2.0 of this study, but it has, so if you look for self-binding microdose study, you're going to see like a second version of this study. So we are using it in another study. It's still on microdosing. I don't want to get into the differences. I'm not leading that study anymore. It's Alexandra, who's a very talented PhD student at Imperial College. And there is a study which is based on this design that is using MDMA. I think the issue with this design is that if you would have a positive result, nobody knows like how like regulators would look at it. And like, how to like sort of like the in order to really validate this methodology, we would need to move to the FDA with it. But for that, we need a positive study. Our microdosing study was negative. So then, we sort of like can't move it forward for, to see how like a bureaucratic approval machinery reacts to it. So that would be like, really testing it, how it's one thing to publish it, but it's another thing, to submit it as evidence during like these medical evaluation processes that are always different in different countries. And one of the things that, unfortunately, this study came out to be negative, and because of that, we were not able to do it. Otherwise, I would have loved to test it and just to submit it as part of like a microdosing data package, and just to see what people are thinking about it. I think that's why people are wary of it, because researchers are wary of using this methodology, because if you have a positive result, you are unsure how you can use it down the line. Now, I would say that where you can still use this methodology is almost like a chief screening study, where you can set up these self-blinding studies where you collect this preliminary data, and if it comes out to be positive, you probably still need to do a traditional randomized control trial in order to submit it to any sort of ethical any sort of approval process. But I do believe where there is a role for it is this like chief screening study, like you did your observational study without any control condition, and then now you can do this kind of a study and then do the RCT. And, it's just sort of like one more step in between these observational studies and the full RCT. The one thing that I would say is this difficulty is that for this study design to work, like you need an enthusiastic crowd. So like this design would probably not work for something like SSRIs because they're not sexy drugs. And actually, they also wouldn't work with SSRIs because they are prescription drugs. So this methodology only works for things where there is like some enthusiasm from the public, and which is accessible. There is a study that we wanted to do with CBD using this methodology, and we actually got pretty far. But anyway, we ran into some issues. Anyway, I don't want to get into it, and basically we didn't follow through the study. But I think like this would be a good methodology for a CBD study, because CBD is accessible to the public now in many countries, and there is an enthusiasm CBD user base, but there are very few high quality clinical trials with CBD. So that's something that I am trying to set up as we speak. As I said, there was this effort that didn't fall through, but trying to build on top of that. And hopefully it's going to happen at some point.
Yeah, there's actually a question related to this in the chat. In the end of your talk, you speculated that citizen science might end up being more impactful than traditional clinical research. Would you expand your thinking about this? Imagine 50 years in the future. What do you see?
So what I meant by impactful is that it is going to be impactful, or it's going to have a positive impact on more people's lives. So as I said, I think most people in the modern life do not meet the clinical criteria for depression, but a lot of them could use a little bit more well-being, feeling a little bit more connected with themselves, with their communities, just enjoying life better. And I see that, in order to that's why I see psychedelics making a big impact, because the way I see psychedelics is a tool to accomplish that. I think psychedelics are not only a medical treatment, but you can almost think about that as like a prevention tool, prevention of future mental health problems. And just like with every other field of medicine, preventing future problems is much cheaper than treating the problems. And what we want to do with Psydo and with these long-term psychedelic effects is to test this hypothesis where we are looking at psychedelics not as a treatment, but as a preventative measure against, frankly, what is the dullness of modern day life. Like, when you got that 9-to-5 job, and a lot of people use their sparking life. For so many people, their golden years are the university years, because they were doing exciting things, they were going out, they had new experiences. And a lot of people lose that when they settle down, start a job, have their family. And I see psychedelics as a tool to reintroduce novelty into the life of this lifestyle. This is not the fault of the people, it is just the lifestyle. Once you need to earn a money and pay the bills, it's just very easy to fall into that trap. And we want to test, whether psychedelics is useful to counter that dullness of modern day life. And when I say that psychedelic citizen science is going to be more impactful or could be more impactful, what I meant is that this is not going to be investigated by traditional clinical research, but we are going to do this with this citizen science, with the approach with PsyDAO. And because of the number of people who are suffering from this subclinical depression is much larger, I think the impact could be larger. So that was the train of thought there.
Thank you. Are you aware of any studies that attempt to address the effect of psilocybin on the emotional response to chronic pain, like uncoupling of the physiological pain from the emotional component?
So we are actually running now a study here at UCSF jointly with UC Berkeley at Stanford on chronic lower back pain. That study started before I got here, so I wasn't part of the team that set it up. But I'm pretty sure, just knowing the people there is probably something along these lines. So if you type in Stanford, UCSF, lower chronic back pain study, you're going to find some information about that trial. And I think that would be your best shot. So look it up. I'm not sure again, but probably there is something along the lines that the question is about.
The next question in the chat is that, have you encountered any strong opposition or other significant to negative reactions from the true believers of microdosing when you pointed out that the effects might pretty much be just placebo?
Yeah, there was definitely that. It's kind of funny because let's be honest, when we started this trial, the thinking is that, hey, we're gonna be the cool people who demonstrate that microdosing is not just a placebo. We sort of wanted to be psychedelic heroes, but it turned out to be that we became psychedelic villains. But hey, that's the nature of research, right? You do these studies because you don't know the answer, and if the data shows this, then you just gotta go with the data. I'm not gonna apologize for that. But as I said, I think there is a lot of subtlety around this, and what we showed and what is the negative is this between treatment difference, that microdosing did not do better than the placebo control condition. And that's what 99% of modern medicine is focusing on. And actually running this trial, what it have made me realize, and I know I talked about this in the trial as well, that between treatment difference, that's not what patients are experiencing. Patients are experiencing the change over time. And we have shown clearly that there are statistically significant positive improvements in a large number of domains with microdosing for that. So that's why I am trying to always emphasize is that our results are not clear-cut negative. People are doing clearly better. We clearly show that. It's just that they are not doing better statistically speaking than the placebo group. And the modern medical literature is obsessed with that. As I said, most depression trials do not even disclose how much get their patients off, which I think is crazy. I think we need to find a balance between these two. I think it is the specific effects of the treatment that's clearly an interesting question scientifically, because you don't want to approve snake oil. But how much is the patient improvement? That's clearly relevant, especially because likely there's going to be some sort of an interaction between the two. So it's not like that there is a placebo effect and there is a true drug effect, and you can just make a linear sum of the two. There are going to be some, what we are calling statistically speaking, the interaction effects. The knowing that you take the drug and the placebo effect could be more than the sum of these two components. And there are ways to test it. It's called the balanced placebo design. And it is basically like a 2x2 drug design where people either get the active drug or the placebo. and they are being told that they're getting either the active drug or the placebo, and that allows you to calculate these interaction effects. Unfortunately, this is a very difficult study to run for multiple reasons. One of them is that there are 4 groups, so you need like a really large sample size. And as I said, with psychedelics, like money, sample size, it's just already a big issue. The other one is this ethical dilemma, is that in this paradigm, you need to lie to patients because there is going to be a group where you tell them that they are going to get placebo, but they actually get the active drug. You can easily see this one going wrong where, like, somebody is getting a little bit paranoid because they have been told that they are going to get placebo, but they're clearly feeling some psychedelic effects. That could easily go wrong. That's not hard to see. So I think this 2x2 design that would allow to test this, that would be scientifically super interesting, but it's practically very difficult for financial reasons and for this ethical reason that it involves deceiving and lying to the patients.
Right. There is actually one question in the chat that has some overlap with what you said. Even with unregulated and black markets sold psychedelic substances, people globally have reported such tremendous positive effects. One could only imagine with the positive effects of deliberately manufactured and regulated sold psychedelics/medicines, especially compared to the widespread damages of things such as hard drugs, alcohol, and cigarettes. Do you think people are just unaware of psychedelics' potential positive effects both clinically and recreationally, or is this because of old hardline politics and misinformation surrounding these compounds, and how do we combat it? I would like to start by saying that I think our task as scientists is to actually investigate their potential and what it actually is, independent of what people actually think about them. Is there something you would like to add?
Well, I think, what's important here is that this is like very much in change now how psychedelics are publicly perceived, right? So I am taking this call from San Francisco. Here, people don't have negative expectations about psychedelics, right? There's also a generational divide. Like, when I got into psychedelic research and I first started to talk to my parents about it, like they were like, "Oh, those are the drugs that drive you crazy." Like, that. And my parents are like well educated. They are like not like stupid, but that's what they've been told. And bear in mind, I'm from Hungary, so from behind the Iron Curtain. So there was like a different world back there. But in their generation, like people know very little about psychedelics, and what they tend to know is just like this like sort of like 70s propaganda. But I think in younger generation, again, I'm in my mid-30s. I think in my generation, like psychedelics, it's sometimes almost like overly positive. Like it's too much on the other side, like being unrealistically positive. And there is a geographical distribution as well, if like where you are. Um, as I said, I'm from Budapest. Like in Budapest, like psychedelics are generally still like looked much more negatively compared to San Francisco. So it's complicated and it's changing. And just because of how everything works, like there's some hype overshoot, as I like to call it, where we are like, overclaiming what these drugs can and cannot do. So like, I'm just running actually a meta-analysis study, and I'm just like in the middle of the analysis. So if you see it like a year later and what I tell you is not exactly what's in the paper, please forgive me. But so if you look at SSRIs, the remission rates, so that what percentage of people are basically symptom-free, back to normal levels of depression scores, it's between 40 to 50% with SSRIs, which is not great. 40 to 50, so it's basically less than half of the people. With psychedelics, it's about 65%, which is clearly higher, but it's also very far from 100%. And there is this narrative that psychedelics are like, one psychedelic session is like equivalent to doing like, years and years of psychotherapy. That is just clearly not true. And there are instances of like this where initially, when psychedelics started to come out, and I think it's like the mid 2010s when like psychedelics started to sort of like coming to the mainstream, and interest in the medical application have started to creep in. And a lot of those trials were like small phase 1 trials. And it's the nature of every medication, not just with psychedelics, that the later phases the trials are in, the more things you are controlling for, the larger your sample size is, the effects are always falling. It's not just for psychedelics, it's for every drug. So early on, there has been like these small studies with incredibly good results. But now we're doing the phase 2 studies, the phase 3 studies, and it still looks good. Like, not, I think there's clearly potential here, but it's not like that, just like one psychedelic session and it's going to cure depression for 99% of the people. Right. So I think, as we move forward, we have to find that balance between, let's say, like, 70s, like anti-psychedelic propaganda versus like mid 2010s, like new age hippie over enthusiasm. We got to settle down somewhere in the middle where the facts are going to line up.
Right, I completely agree. The last question I want to take from the chat is that if I didn't mishear, I think you mentioned that the cost of running your study was around, was it $10,000? Yeah.
Yeah.
So what did this amount include? I imagine that just the pay for the working hours of your research team would quickly surpass the mentioned amount. So it left me wondering if that only referred to a part of the total costs, or if doing the whole thing from beginning to end was just much quicker than one might think.
So the $10,000 is basically for the various online services that we used. So, for example, as I said, we use this online cognitive testing platform. We had to pay for that. We had another survey platform for these questionnaires. We had to pay for that. We had to pay for some other services. So that's what the $10,000 refers to. This study was like we never had any funding for it. I had this idea for the cell binding study, and then I went to David Eritso, who I mentioned, who is the medical doctor of the Imperial College team. I knew him from a conference before, and then early on we tried to raise money for it, and we just didn't manage to. But both of us like the idea so much. David, like myself, is also a friend of citizen science, and we are interested in these sort of things. So then we just said we're just going to go ahead and do it. So that $10,000, like, that does not include my salary who worked on it, because there was no salary. It was basically a passion project. But I would say that, like, even if you add on, like, like the cost of like a researcher who is running this trial, that is still way, way, way lower than a traditional RCT. Because in a traditional RCT, practically speaking, what makes it expensive, one of them is compliance with all of the regulations. That's a lot of paperwork. The other is that there's going to be some space in the hospital where that trial is running. That's going to be expensive, and it's going to include MD personnel, and that's going to be expensive, because basically you are paying for their med school, like, and people who are doing the evaluations on site, and these sort of things. And that's what drives up the cost, the time of the MDs and the space in the hospital. They didn't have either, because this was a global study. Everything was run through the internet. So we didn't have any one-to-one patient engagement and, by an MD. The one-to-one patient engagement by an MD, that's a major driver of a clinical research cost. We didn't have that. So yeah, even if I would have had a salary, and if we would add that on top of that $10,000, it would still be much, much, much cheaper than any traditional RCTs.
Right. Thank you so much for being our guest today, Balázs. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Is there anything you would like to say before I move to saying a few closing words?
I just want to say that, like, Psydo is a new organization, and people can contribute in many different ways. It is a very democratic, open platform. If you have any question, you can put in a proposal and run a campaign to get it funded. Not just scientists can propose projects, anybody. So if you're somebody who feel that you don't have the academic credential to do something with psychedelic research, but you feel you have a good idea, this is the perfect place to start. And I think General Lab Psycho is a good, if anybody is interested in sort of like cutting edge, like how we're going to change science, scientific methodology, and psychedelics, it's a great community, and we are early, so it's a good time also to engage with. Just Google Psycho, you're going to find the website. Yeah, it's a good crew.